In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to our study of Ruth chapter 4. We continue our journey through the book of Ruth. My brothers and sisters, this chapter is so important because it helps us to understand how Boaz accepted the role as the kinsman redeemer, and eventually how Ruth would become a matriarch in the line of descendants that led to the Messiah. So let's talk about that. We'll read the text and then go through the notes. So in chapter 4, it begins and it says that Boaz went to the gate and he sat down there. Now, you might remember from chapter 3 that when Ruth came to Boaz on the threshing floor, she laid at his feet, and Boaz awoke surprised at midnight. And he said to Ruth, wait till the morning. There's another relative, a possible kinsman redeemer who's closer than me. So Boaz goes right up to the gate to settle this matter right away. Boaz went up to the gate and he sat down there. He's waiting for this guy to come by. He's looking for his opportunity. He's not going to waste any time. And behold, the next of kin, okay, so that's the closest relative to the deceased, to Mahon, who's Ruth's husband, and this is his closest relative, the one who has the right to be the kinsman redeemer in this case. The next of kin of whom Boaz had spoken came by. And so Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, and sit down here." And this is really interesting because he literally calls the guy like John Doe. It's really interesting that the name of this person is never revealed, and it's intentional. It's within the narrative. It's contrasting the prestigious role that Boaz has and accepts as the kinsman redeemer, and it's showing, essentially this man rejected it. So his name really isn't important. Okay. So turn aside, friend. You could really translate this so and so or John Doe. And we'll talk about that in the notes. And some translations might be a little bit more literal and say something like, so and so or John Doe. Turn aside, friend. Sit down here. He wants to settle the case right away. I love the way Boaz wants to, he wants to determine what's going on in this situation. And part of it is his care for Naomi and her family. And so he turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city. Now, this is how cases were settled during the monarchical period. Okay. The elders of the city sat at the gate of the city and they settled these cases. The gate of the city was a place of transaction, but especially a place of judgment. And so Boaz needs 10 elders from the city. And he said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. And what I love about this is how Boaz is giving these commands and they're all going along with it. Maybe it's because he was an important man in the city, but nevertheless, I love his determination to essentially bring closure to this situation. It's all tied to a great care for Naomi's family, her deceased husband, and her deceased children. So then he said to the next of kin, the possible kinsman redeemer, and Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land which belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. And so it's up for sale. Now, imagine they had been away for 10 years. They came back and they haven't had any harvest of food for 10 years. So they're probably hurting. She's probably hurting economically. She's got to get rid of it. And very interestingly, when you go to the book of Leviticus chapter 25, it talks about the year of Jubilee and how land could be redeemed if it was lost. And how would it be lost? Well, through poverty, through a bad harvest, and you would actually have to sell the land. But in order to keep the tribe, the clan, and the family united, those family members who lost that land they could come back, or their relatives could come back on the year of Jubilee, and they could get the land back. They could buy it back. Isn't that beautiful if you think about it? So Naomi's selling the land. This is not going in a good direction here, okay? She's selling the parcel of land that belonged to Elimelech. Implicitly, there's a huge economic problem here. And he says, so I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here. So what's really interesting is how Boaz brings up the land first. He doesn't bring up anything about Ruth, one of Naomi's children. His former wife is here, the widow. You could be the kinsman redeemer, but no. Let's talk about redeeming the land first. And some scholars suggest that maybe this makes it less controversial. It doesn't make this potential kinsman redeemer look as bad because he's going to say yes and then no, instead of simply no and that's it. Okay, so it shows how he's at least half willing to do something. And so some scholars think that Boaz is kind of allowing him not to look too bad in this situation. Okay, and that's kind of interesting. So I thought I would tell you about it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it. You're the closest one. You have the right to redeem this land as the closest relative. And look at what he says, okay? And I come after you. So Boaz says, but you know what? Hey, I'm the second closest. So you got first chance to make the choice. And if not, I'm here. Okay. So you won't feel bad if you walk away. So notice how Boaz he's giving him the opportunity, but he's also in every way saying, if you can't do this, I'm over here. Okay. I can take care of this. And he said, so the man whose name is never mentioned, he said, I will redeem it. He's all in for the land. Yeah, I'll take that land. I can use a little bit extra property. That's great. I'll redeem it. I'll pay her the price, whatever it is. And then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also buying Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the dead, in order to restore the name of the dead to his inheritance. So he says, oh, a little bit of fine print here. Guess what? Guess what? The former wife, the widow of Naomi's deceased son, her name is Ruth, the Moabitess. She's here. And guess what? She's also included in this transaction. You will be the kinsman redeemer of the land and a kinsman redeemer in this family. How about that? Where you will willingly give yourself to this role of this marriage. And so one thing to remember from our previous video, that in order to be the kinsman redeemer of a relative who died, it was something you did willingly. You willingly gave yourself to this marriage. And so then the next of kin said, whose name is never mentioned. Notice how the narrative very artistically does not mention his name. And that's because he's not important, because he doesn't want to have a role. He's trying to say something about his ultimate rejection. And he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. He doesn't explain why, but he basically says, Boaz is sitting there saying, if you don't redeem it, I will. He offers him the opportunity. He allows him to at least say yes to the land, which proves that he's not the worst guy in the world. But then he doesn't want the marriage part. He doesn't want that. He doesn't explain why. And you look at Ruth, and she's a Moabitess, and so maybe he had a problem with that, with a woman from Moab. You got to be kidding me. So, verse 7, it says, "Now this was the custom in the former times of Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction." So, let's see what it was. "The one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel." And this is really important because when you look at the concept of the kinsman redeemer in Deuteronomy chapter 25, if the brother refused, you could, shake your sandal at him. So some scholars will say that the law of the kinsman redeemer in Deuteronomy 5 is kind of a model. It's not being applied specifically. We'll look at that when we get into the notes. And so when the next of kin, the guy whose name is never mentioned, said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal, and then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are the witnesses. This day I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belongs to Elimelech, everything that belongs to him, and all that belongs to Chilion and to Malon, his children." Okay, the ones who passed away. And of course, it was Malon who was the husband of Ruth, who passed away and left her as a widow. Also included in this, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Malon, I have bought to be my wife. I bought to be my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. And so this is so profound because he's perpetuating the name of the dead person, Malone. So now Malone will not be considered to be without descendants, and that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. So he's doing this incredible act of favor and love towards the family of Elimelech. And you can really see, if you read the book closely, the great respect that Boaz has for Naomi, and for her family, and then also for Ruth because of all that she's done for Naomi. And it underlines something about this marriage, that it's not based on physical attraction, but it's really tied to character and seeing the good qualities that Ruth has, especially. And so then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house." Now, what's beautiful here is the focus turns to Ruth. Okay. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah." And why Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel? "And may you prosper in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem," the very area where the Messiah will be born. "And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." Okay. And what's so beautiful about this is, you might remember that Rachel and Leah both had problems conceiving and so forth, and eventually they were given the gift of children. And here God is helping Ruth through all these problems that she had. So may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah. And through them, they built up the house of Israel. Their children became essentially the house of Israel. "And may you prosper in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." And so once again, you see that Tamar, she's going to be mentioned in the genealogy in Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 1. And it goes on, it says, "Because of the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman." And so what's amazing is this blessing that they're wishing as they look back to Rachel, Leah, and Tamar. What's so beautiful about this blessing is that it's going to be fulfilled in the most incredible way, because Ruth is going to be one of the four women mentioned in Matthew's gospel. And there's a reason why four women are mentioned in the genealogy in Matthew's gospel. Correction. Many women are mentioned in Matthew's gospel, but four women mentioned in the genealogy in Matthew's gospel. We'll talk about that in just a moment when we go to the notes. So it says that, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Notice how conception, the gift of conception, is directly related to the Lord's action, a complete gift from the Lord. And when you go to the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 1, you see that man is created and men and women are created in the divine image and likeness. And then God gives them the command to be fruitful and multiply, to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. And so it's so beautiful when you read the book of Genesis and you see that the command that God gives them to be fruitful and multiply, it's the very first command that he gives in order, if you're reading from the book of Genesis. And that really underlines something about openness to life. And especially in the church, when we talk about the grave sin of contraception and how our modern culture has essentially rejected this. And we have to be countercultural if we want to live the faith. And we want to in a special way, encourage our people to rediscover what it means to be open to life and how God blesses people when they are. I come from a big family, and I'll tell you, the Lord blesses big families. And how sad it is that many families are not open to life. And I believe that there's a lot of difficulties, even suffering that occurs later in life because many simply reject having children. And when they get older, they regret it. So it says, then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life. And I love this image. Boaz is going to be a restorer of life to Ruth because Boaz is going to be the kinsman redeemer, and he will willingly accept the role. And this is exactly what Jesus does. Jesus is our Redeemer who has willingly accepted the role, and he is a restorer of life. As a matter of fact, in him we have the promise of the resurrected and glorified body. So this phrase, calling Boaz a restorer of life, I think it has a very profound theological sense to it. And so he shall be a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. And they named him Oved. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, notice how this is amazing because now we see all of this is happening so that we can understand the Davidic monarchy, so that we can understand a little bit about David's history. But it's also amazing to think that David had a Moabite great-grandmother. And so now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram of Aminadab, Aminadab of Nashon, Nashon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Oved, Oved of Jesse, and Jesse of David. And so ends the book of Ruth. Notice how it ends, underlining how Ruth is the great-grandmother of the future King David. And so in a certain way, you can imagine people reading this during the time of the Davidic monarchy, if it was written during that period, and just thinking that this is amazing, that David, generations earlier, his great-grandmother was a foreigner, a Moabite, and God did so much through this family that not only was a kinsman redeemer found for the family of Naomi, but through God's providence, Ruth would be the great grandmother of King David. And so let's talk a little bit about our notes here. So Boaz goes right to the gate. He's waiting for the next of kin. I love his determination. He sits at the gate. And so there's something beautiful about this. Some scholars believe that the practice really looks at the monarchical period and that you wouldn't have seen this in the Second Temple period. So some argue that there's many things in Ruth that point to an earlier date, and others will say maybe it's looking back at this period, early period in a very ideal way. So thus Boaz went up to the city gate and he sat at the city gate waiting for what is constantly called the Goel, Goel, the Redeemer. Okay, so he's waiting for the Redeemer, the potential Redeemer, who was the nearest relative or the next of kin. So most interesting in the text is that this potential Redeemer, as I said before, he is never named. He's never named. In Hebrew, he's called, I think it's verse 4, he's called the Poloni Almoni, which kind of, means, so and so or such and such. And some will call him, just John Doe. But it's really funny how it rhymes. He's called, he calls him the Poloni Almoni. He says, hey, Poloni Almoni. In our text here, if you go back to the text, it's in verse 1 actually here. Turn aside, friend. But here he says, turn aside, Poloni Almoni, which kind of means turn aside so and so, turn aside such and such, sit down here. And so he's never given a name, which is actually intentional in the narrative. The narrative does not want to give a name to the man who would simply reject such a prestigious offer to be a kinsman redeemer, even though it wasn't obligatory. So Boaz, he finds 10 elders and he's really demanding them, sit here, we need to decide this, and they go along with it. And maybe it's because they knew the situation. And so if there's a potential to find a kinsman redeemer, they were all in. So Boaz brings with the fact that Naomi was selling the land that belonged to Elimelech. I mean, in other words, the situation's pretty desperate. She's, obviously she needs to sell the land. And so something needs to be decided because she's selling the land right now. And so what's really interesting too, you might want to look at Leviticus 25 and really just look at how the Jubilee year talks about redeeming land. And so following one scholar whose name is Andre Lacoque, he outlines a couple things about Leviticus 25 verses 23 to 25. And this is pretty interesting. First and foremost, if you read these verses, the land belongs to the Lord. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to God. Okay. So thus, all sale of the land is really only for a temporary period of time. Okay. That's interesting. And there always remains a possibility for redemption if there is a redeemer, a Goel, who is the closest relative, closest heir, the next of kin. Thus, if there is no kinsman redeemer, then the land can be redeemed during the year of Jubilee. Okay, so if there's no redeemer, if it gets sold, then it can be redeemed during the year of Jubilee. So the implication is that we're nowhere close to a year of Jubilee. This would only happen every 50 years. So that's the implication here. And so the law related to the Levirate marriage, okay, to the situation of the kinsman redeemer, it's found in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. So you might want to look that up. We're going to read through it very quickly here. And here's what it says. It says basically that if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. This is beautiful. Shall not be married outside of the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed. Notice this, the first son shall succeed to the name of his brother who is dead. In other words, that son is considered a descendant of that deceased brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. Now, the whole law of the kinsman redeemer and doing this act to redeem the name of your brother, it's beautiful in a certain sense. And especially this concept of his name not be blotted, his name will not be blotted out. And it really provides some background if you think of Christ as the true kinsman redeemer who comes to give us eternal life so that we will not suffer eternal judgment. And so, verse 7, it says, if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And so a lot of times people, when they read Ruth, they ask the question, now, why wasn't Ruth pulling off his sandals, spitting in his face, and really giving it to this guy, to the no-namer? And so there's a number of opinions on this. Some scholars will say that the Levirate law doesn't apply completely in this situation. Here we're looking possibly at cousins who are not blood brothers, but just more distant family members. There's a few reasons that might apply to this, and others will say that it just wasn't followed, but something close to it was followed. So you're going to find some different opinions on why didn't Ruth pull off his sandal and spit in his face anyhow. That would have been dramatic, right? And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. Okay, and maybe as a Moabite too, but there's not a clear reason why. Okay, and the name of his house and shall be called in Israel the house of him that has his sandal pulled off. And so it's definitely a dishonorable thing to avoid this, even though it's optional. But what is interesting is if you go back to the man who refuses, okay, Boaz refers to him as Poloni Almoni, and it's intentionally a rhyming phrase, which can mean so and so, such and such, or John Doe. And so you can see how the book of Ruth essentially looks at this man, never gives him a name, and underlines, he really had an opportunity here that he missed. He could have been the kinsman redeemer. So the implications of the Levirate law, thus, if the closest relative assumes the duties of the kinsman redeemer, then the child born would be considered to be the child or heir of the deceased brother. But as I said, some scholars argue that the Levirate law provides guidelines to the situation because of the unnamed relative. The unnamed relative and Boaz, they're not brothers technically. They're likely cousins or more distant relatives. So Ruth is ultimately the great grandmother of King David. And so she's a woman of extraordinary courage. She made great sacrifices. In many ways, she's like a model convert, as I discuss in the other videos. She encounters Boaz at the threshing floor. The threshing floor sometimes is a place of judgment. And for instance, the very first Psalm of the Psalter talks about separating the wheat from the chaff. It provides this image of how God will separate the righteous from the unrighteous on the day of judgment. You might also remember that it was David who offered a sacrifice on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, and thus he stopped a plague. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 24. The temple was built over this threshing floor as well. And as I mentioned earlier, threshing floors were often built in elevated areas. So here's the place where Ruth encounters Boaz, and both of them are honorable in that encounter. Okay, and it tells you something about the great respect that they have for this future marriage. And that's something that you see throughout the book of Ruth. She's really an example of faithfulness. She leaves everything in her country and really reminds you of Genesis chapter 12 when Abraham left his homeland. So she imitates the faith of Abraham, okay, going with her mother-in-law, Naomi, to another country that she doesn't even know, okay? She's obedient to Naomi. She says, I will do everything that you say, exactly what Israel said when they were at Mount Sinai. So let's look at this. Look at the humility of Ruth, okay? In the 4 chapters that we have, she does not consider her own livelihood, but she stays with Naomi. She has a desire to become part of the people of Israel. She desires to accept the God of Israel. She desires to live and die and be buried in Israel. All that's in chapter 1. She asked Naomi for permission to glean in the corner of Boaz's field, and she's very respectful throughout the book to every person she encounters. She never even assumes something, even though as a poor widow, she would have had the right. Okay, so even though she has the right, she's humble, she's respectful. We can learn something from her. She gleaned from morning to midday without stopping. She demonstrates her good character. She recounted to Boaz that he had comforted her and spoken to the heart of his maidservant. And she refers to herself as Boaz's servant or handmaid. She lays at the feet of Boaz, a sign of submission, but she waits for his instruction. And Boaz wants to wait for the other kinsman redeemer. So there's this beautiful respect that goes throughout the entire book, even a great respect for marriage and family. And so she asked Boaz to cover her, and Boaz says, there's another kinsman redeemer. Let's work this out first, okay? And let's find out where this situation's going. So then when you get to the Gospel of Matthew and you look at the Gospel of Matthew, I have a couple videos on this. If you go to the playlist on the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew brings up 4 women in his genealogy. It's really interesting. He doesn't need to do this, but he does, okay? So he brings up that Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, by Tamar. Tamar, who acted as a prostitute and had a child through Judah. And then going on, he brings up Boaz, the father of Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. Wow. So he brings up Rahab, who was a foreigner as well, a resident of the city of Jericho, who believed in the God of Israel, not her own gods, and was spared when the city of Jericho fell under God's judgment. And then Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. And then Matthew brings up Ruth, the Moabitess. So notice what he's bringing up, a woman who, in order to keep the line going, acted as if she was a prostitute. And 2 foreigners here, okay, one who was a prostitute, one who was a Moabitess. The Moabites were known as an immoral people. And then finally, it brings up, and Jesse, the father of David the king, and it goes on, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And then another woman who was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who committed adultery with David. And you can listen to my tapes, my videos on 2 Samuel 11. She probably didn't have much choice in the matter. So obviously David was more culpable or completely culpable. But why would Matthew bring up these four women who had such crazy situations, to make a long story short, to put it lightly? And there's really something amazing here. If you have any questions about our Blessed Mother who is a virgin, go look at your history and see how God could take the most unusual situations and use all of these to prepare for the coming of the Christ, the Messiah. My brothers and sisters, we finish on that note. May the Lord pour out his blessing upon the entire church. May he bless our families, and in a special way, may all of our marriages understand how God is in charge. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.